I never wanted to move to Snowberry. It wasn't the kind of fresh start I had in mind. Not for me. Not for Lucas. It's the kind of town that feels like it's stuck in time, with streets named after dead people and decorations that haven't been changed in decades. But after the divorce and the messy custody hearings, this was the only place I could afford. A cheap rental with peeling wallpaper, creaky floors, and a half-broken furnace. Lucas didn't seem to mind, though. Kids are resilient that way. While I worried about bills and whether I could make Christmas special for him, he was just excited about the snow. "It's like a Christmas movie, Mom," he'd said the first morning we woke up to fresh powder outside. The town leaned hard into the whole Christmas thing. Lights strung up on every lamppost, fake snowmen propped up on porches, and a massive tree in the center of town, decorated with garish tinsel and candy canes. The radio station only played Christmas music, and every store window looked like it had been assaulted by an overzealous elf. And then there was the Santa Walk. It's a tradition here, apparently. Every Christmas Eve, volunteers dressed as Santa Claus visit homes across town, bringing small gifts for the kids. Lucas was thrilled when he heard about it. "Santa's coming to our house?" he asked, his eyes wide. I nodded, forcing a smile. "Yeah, I guess so." But I couldn't shake the unease. Something about the idea didn't sit right with me. Letting a stranger in a costume into my house, even for a few minutes? Maybe I was being paranoid, but it felt invasive. Still, I didn't want to ruin it for Lucas. After everything he'd been through this year, losing his dad, moving to this tiny town, I figured he deserved something magical. That week, the school held their annual Christmas party, complete with a visit from Santa. Lucas couldn't stop talking about it when he got home. "He was there, Mom. The real Santa." I laughed. "You mean a guy in a costume?" "No, it was him. He said so." Lucas's face was flushed, his excitement spilling over into his words. "He told me I've been really good this year. He said he's bringing me a special gift on Christmas Eve." "Did he now?" I ruffled his hair, trying not to overthink it. "Well, I guess we'll see." But something about the way Lucas said it stuck with me. He sounded certain, like he truly believed it wasn't just some guy in a cheap suit. That night, I stayed up late grading papers at the kitchen table. The clock had just ticked past midnight when I heard it. The faint, distant jingle of bells. I froze, my pen hovering over the page. It was so faint, I thought I might have imagined it. But then it came again, clearer this time, the soft, rhythmic jingle of sleigh bells. I stood and walked to the window, peeking out into the snowy darkness. The street was empty, the houses dark and silent. A few Christmas lights blinked lazily in the distance, but there was no sign of anyone outside. I was about to turn away when I saw him. At the far end of the street, standing perfectly still in the glow of a street lamp, was a man in a Santa suit. He wasn't moving, just standing there, half shrouded in shadow, his face obscured by the angle of the light. A chill ran down my spine. It wasn't unusual to see people dressed as Santa this time of year, not with the Santa Walk coming up, but there was something wrong about him. The suit looked old, the red fabric dark and frayed. His hat drooped awkwardly, and his beard hung unevenly, like it hadn't been cleaned in years. And then he moved, just a slight tilt of the head, like he was looking at me. I stepped back from the window, my heart pounding. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the floor, listening, for I don't even know what. When I finally worked up the courage to look again, he was gone. The street was empty, the snow pristine and untouched. I told myself it was nothing, just a random volunteer getting into character for the Santa Walk. But the next morning, when Lucas found the box on the porch, I wasn't so sure anymore. It was small and perfectly wrapped in red paper, with no tag or markings. Lucas picked it up eagerly, but I grabbed it from him before he could open it. "Wait," I said. "We don't know who it's from." "But it's for me," Lucas whined, reaching for it. I sighed, setting it on the table. "Let me check it first, okay? Go get ready for school." He groaned but obeyed, trudging upstairs. I stared at the box for a long time before peeling back the paper. Inside was a single candy cane, a kind with red and white stripes. It looked ordinary enough at first glance, but when I picked it up, something small and white tumbled out of the wrapping. I frowned, leaning closer. It was a tooth, small, jagged at the root, and flecked with dried blood. I didn't tell Lucas. I shoved the box into the trash and drove him to school, trying to act normal. But my hands were shaking the entire way, and I couldn't stop thinking about that man in the Santa suit. Whoever he was, he'd been here, and he wasn't done yet. The box with the tooth haunted me all day. I tried to tell myself it was some kind of prank, maybe some twisted local kid, thinking it would be funny to scare the new family in town. But no matter how many times I told myself that, I couldn't shake the image of the man in the Santa suit. The way he'd stood so still, the slight tilt of his head, the red suit hanging off him like it didn't quite fit. That night, after Lucas went to bed, I sat at the kitchen table staring at the trash can. The box was still in there, under a layer of discarded gift wrap and coffee grounds. I didn't want to touch it again, but I couldn't stop thinking about it. Finally, I caved. I pulled on a pair of rubber gloves, fished the box out, and set it on the table. The tooth was small, jagged, and unmistakably real. I held it up to the light, squinting. Was it a baby tooth? Maybe. But who would go to the trouble of wrapping something like this, and why? I thought about calling the police, but I stopped myself. What would I say? Someone left a candy cane and a tooth on my porch. They'd laugh me off the phone. Still, something about it felt deliberate, like it was a message. The next day, I dropped Lucas off at school and decided to take the morning off from grading papers. I couldn't stop thinking about what Lucas had said. The strange Santa who whispered to him at the school party. It didn't take long to find Lucas's teacher, Miss Holt, a cheerful woman in her early 40s with glasses and a red Christmas sweater that jingled when she moved. "Oh, the kids loved the Santa visit," she said, smiling. "It's their favorite part of the year." "Who was he?" I asked, trying to keep my tone casual. "Oh, one of the volunteers, I think," she said, frowning slightly. "The PTA usually organizes it. Why?" "Lucas said something weird about him," I said carefully, "that he told him he was going to bring a special gift." Her smile faltered. "Oh," she said after a pause, looking uneasy. "I'm sure he didn't mean anything by it. The volunteers try to make it personal for the kids, you know, to make it feel magical." "Right," I said. "Of course." But something in her expression made me think she wasn't telling me everything. That evening, as I helped Lucas with his homework, my phone buzzed. It was a text from a number I didn't recognize. "Look into Ellie Dawson." My stomach clenched. I stared at the message for a long time, my mind racing. Ellie Dawson. That name sounded familiar, and then it hit me. Ellie was in Lucas's class. The next morning, I went to the school office under the pretense of dropping off paperwork. While I waited, I glanced at the bulletin board by the front desk. Flyers for bake sales and winter concerts covered most of it, but near the bottom, almost hidden, was a faded missing poster. It was Ellie. I remembered her now, a quiet, polite girl who had always been shy around adults. Lucas had mentioned her once or twice, saying she liked to draw pictures of animals. The poster said she'd gone missing 3 days ago. I asked the school secretary about it, but she gave me a tight-lipped smile and waved me off. "Oh, that's nothing," she said. Her parents said she went to visit family out of town for the holidays. "That's strange," I said. Why would they put up a missing poster if she's with family? Her smile didn't waver. Small town gossip, you know? It gets blown out of proportion. But her tone said, "Drop it." At home that night, Lucas sat at the kitchen table drawing while I cooked dinner. His crayons scratched softly against the paper, and for a moment the normalcy of it eased the tension in my chest. "What are you drawing?" I asked. "Santa," he said, without looking up. I walked over, wiping my hands on a towel, and froze when I saw the picture. It wasn't like the cheerful Santas you see on Christmas cards. This one looked wrong. His suit was dark red, almost brown, with jagged black lines across it like tears or stains. His beard was messy, uneven, and his smile stretched so wide it almost split his face. Behind him was a sleigh, but instead of reindeer, there were shadowy shapes, long and thin, with twisted limbs and glowing red eyes. And inside the sleigh, "Are those kids?" I asked, pointing to the small figures crammed into the sleigh. "Yeah," Lucas said, still coloring. "That's where he keeps them." I didn't sleep much that night. The next morning, I called Maggie, a local reporter I'd met a few weeks ago. She'd been covering some of the school events, and we'd exchanged numbers when she interviewed me about my first impressions of Snowbury. When I brought up Ellie's disappearance, she was quiet for a long time. "You should meet me for coffee," she said finally. "I think there's something you need to see." We met at a small diner on the edge of town, the kind of place that smelled like burnt toast and coffee grounds. Maggie looked tired, her hair pulled back into a messy ponytail, dark circles under her eyes. She slid a folder across the table to me. Inside were newspaper clippings, missing posters, and grainy photographs. 6 kids, she said, her voice low, all gone in the past 5 years, always around Christmas, always from Snowbury. I stared at the papers, my chest tightening. "The police don't do anything because there's no proof of foul play," Maggie said bitterly. "It's a small town. People don't want to admit there's a problem. They'd rather believe the kids just ran away or moved." She hesitated, then leaned closer. "There's always a Santa." "What?" "In every case, the kids were last seen with someone in a Santa suit." I shook my head. "You think it's the same person? For 5 years?" Maggie shrugged. "Maybe. Or maybe it's someone new every time. I don't know, but I know it's not a coincidence." That night, I stayed up waiting for Lucas to fall asleep. When I was sure he was out, I went outside with a flashlight, scanning the snow around our house. At first, I didn't see anything, but then, near Lucas's bedroom window, I spotted them. Footprints. Deep, heavy prints leading from the street to the side of the house. And in the snow beneath the window, something small and shiny caught the light. I crouched down, brushing the snow away, and felt my stomach twist. It was a jingle bell. I woke with a start to the sound of the front door slamming. It took a second for my groggy brain to catch up, but then I realized what I was hearing. Footsteps crunching in the snow, moving away from the house. "Lucas." I shot out of bed and ran to his room, my heart pounding. His bed was empty, the blankets kicked to the floor. The window was cracked open, letting in a bitter gust of cold air, and on the sill, I spotted something that made my stomach drop. A single candy cane, perfectly placed, with the red stripes glistening as though freshly polished. My hands shook as I grabbed my boots and jacket. I didn't even think to call the police. I knew they wouldn't do anything. I knew it was up to me. The footprints outside the house were small and fresh, leading toward the woods at the edge of town. Lucas's footprints. And next to them, a larger set, heavy and deliberate. The snowstorm had started again, a kind that muffled everything and made it feel like the whole world had shrunk down to just me and the trail in front of me. My flashlight cut through the dark, but every shadow felt alive. Every sound made me jump. The footprints led deeper and deeper into the woods, the trees growing thicker, their skeletal branches twisting together like claws. And then the smell hit me. It was faint at first, but as I followed the trail, it grew stronger, a metallic, rotting stench that turned my stomach. That's when I saw it, the cabin. It sat in a clearing, leaning slightly to one side like it was too tired to stand upright. The windows were boarded up, and the roof sagged under the weight of the snow, but light leaked out from between the slats in the boards. Warm, flickering light, firelight. My pulse pounded in my ears as I crept closer, trying to stay silent. The footprints led straight to the door. The smell was overwhelming now, and I fought the urge to gag. I could feel it in my throat like it was trying to crawl inside me. I peered through a crack in the boards, and my breath caught in my throat. The cabin was a nightmare. The floor was littered with broken toys, stuffed animals torn open, trains with their wheels ripped off, dolls with their faces gouged out. Piles of discarded clothing were shoved into corners, some of them so small they looked like they could fit toddlers. But the worst part was the table. It sat in the center of the room, long and low, made of rough wood. Plates and cutlery were scattered across it, but they weren't clean. They were streaked with something dark, something red. A chair was set at the head of the table, its back high and carved with jagged symbols I didn't recognize. And on the floor next to it was a burlap sack, tied shut with a thick piece of twine. The sack bulged unnaturally, and every so often it twitched. I couldn't see Lucas. Panic clawed at my chest as I circled the cabin, trying to find another way in. I didn't want to think about what was in the sack. I couldn't think about it. Then I heard the voice, deep and low, with a rasping edge, like every word was dragged over broken glass. "You've been very, very good this year," it said, "and now it's time for your reward." My heart stopped. I pressed myself against the wall, straining to hear. "Special children deserve special gifts," the voice continued, "and I'm going to make you into something beautiful." I found an open window near the back of the cabin, the wood around it warped and rotting. Climbing through wasn't quiet, but the storm outside seemed to muffle the noise. The smell inside was worse, like the air itself had turned sour. My boots crunched on broken glass as I crept through the narrow hallway toward the flickering light at the end. When I stepped into the main room, I froze. Lucas was tied to a chair near the fire, his arms and legs bound with thick ropes. His face was streaked with tears, but he wasn't hurt. Not yet. The man in the Santa suit stood over him, holding something long and thin in one hand, a carving knife. The suit looked even worse up close. The red fabric was faded and stiff, stained with patches of something dark that hadn't been washed out. The fur trim was yellowed and matted, and the beard hung crookedly, revealing pale, waxy skin underneath. But it was his face that made my blood run cold. It was wrong. The grin stretched too wide, the teeth too sharp, the eyes too hollow. And when he turned to look at me, I realized it wasn't just the suit that was stained. His hands were coated in something thick and red, his fingernails crusted with it. "Well," he said, his grin widening, "it seems we have a guest." I didn't think. I just acted. I grabbed the first thing I saw, a rusty candlestick from the table, and swung it as hard as I could. It connected with his shoulder, knocking him back, but not down. He staggered, then turned to me, his grin never faltering. "You're a bold one," he said, his voice almost amused. "But boldness won't save you." He lunged at me, and the fight was brutal. He was stronger than he looked, his hands like iron as he grabbed at me. I screamed, kicking and swinging wildly. but he was relentless. At some point, I managed to grab the carving knife and slash it across his chest. The fabric of the suit ripped, and he let out a howl of pain, the first real emotion I'd seen from him. But then he slammed me into the wall, and the knife clattered out of my hand. The next thing I knew, I was being dragged across the floor, my head spinning and my body aching. He threw me into a small, dark room and slammed the door shut. I scrambled to my feet, banging on the door, but it wouldn't budge. The only light came from a small crack near the bottom, and through it I could see the main room. The man in the Santa suit stood over Lucas again, picking up the knife. "This one's special," he said, almost to himself. "This one's going to make a fine Christmas feast." The door wouldn't budge. I slammed my shoulder into it again and again, ignoring the pain radiating through my body. "Lucas," I screamed. "Lucas, I'm coming." From the other side of the door, I heard the man chuckle. It was deep and guttural, almost playful, like I was part of some sick game. "Don't worry," he said, his voice muffled but dripping with malice. "You'll get your turn. Everyone gets their turn." I dropped to my knees, searching the floor for anything I could use. The air in the tiny room was thick and sour, and the shadows seemed to press in from all sides. My fingers brushed something sharp, and I flinched before grabbing it, a shard of broken glass. It wasn't much, but it was enough. Through the crack under the door, I could see the man leaning over Lucas, holding the carving knife with an almost reverent precision. Lucas whimpered, his small body trembling, but he wasn't screaming. He looked frozen, paralyzed by fear. "Don't cry," the man said, his tone eerily gentle. "It's better if you don't cry. It'll only hurt for a moment. Then you'll be perfect." I didn't wait. With the shard of glass clenched in my hand, I started hacking at the rotted wood around the latch. My hands were shaking, the glass slipping and cutting into my palm, but I didn't care. I didn't stop. The wood finally splintered, and the door swung open. I didn't think. I just ran. The man turned, his face twisting into something monstrous as I slammed into him. We both fell to the floor, and the knife clattered out of his hand, spinning across the room. "Run, Lucas," I screamed, struggling to pin the man down. "Run." Lucas didn't hesitate. He scrambled out of the chair, his arms still tied but his legs free, and bolted toward the door. But the man was fast, too fast. He shoved me off him like I weighed nothing and lunged after Lucas, grabbing him by the back of his shirt. "No!" I screamed, grabbing a heavy iron skillet from the table and swinging it with everything I had. It connected with the back of his head, and this time, he went down. Lucas and I didn't stop to check if he was unconscious. We ran out of the cabin and into the blinding snowstorm, the icy wind cutting through us like knives. "Keep going," I shouted, pushing Lucas ahead of me as fast as his little legs could carry him. My hands fumbled with the ropes around his wrists, trying to untie them as we stumbled through the trees. Behind us, I heard a groan, then the crunch of footsteps in the snow. He was coming. We ran for what felt like forever, the storm swallowing the world around us. The trees loomed like shadows, their branches clawing at us as we passed. Lucas was sobbing, his breath coming in ragged gasps, but he didn't stop. Neither did I. But then, the footsteps behind us stopped, and so did the storm. The wind died suddenly, leaving an eerie silence in its place. The snowflakes hung in the air, frozen mid-fall, as if time itself had stopped. I turned, pulling Lucas behind me, and that's when I saw him. The man in the Santa suit stood about 20 feet away, his silhouette barely visible through the swirling snow. His head was tilted again, that same unnatural angle that made my stomach twist. But this time, he wasn't alone. Shapes began to emerge from the darkness behind him, figures in tattered clothes, their faces pale and gaunt, their eyes black as coal. Some were small, the size of children. Others were taller, their bodies impossibly thin, their limbs jerking unnaturally as they moved. They surrounded him, their heads twitching, their mouths opening and closing like they were trying to speak but couldn't find the words. I grabbed Lucas and took a step back. What is this?" I whispered. The man laughed, a horrible rasping sound that echoed through the trees. "It's tradition," he said. "It's always been tradition." The figures started to move toward us, their footsteps crunching softly in the snow. I yanked Lucas behind me, my body shaking, my mind racing for a way out. The cabin was too far behind us, and the town was miles away. There was nowhere to go. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I spotted something. A small, dilapidated shed half buried in the snow. "Come on," I said to Lucas, pulling him toward it. We bolted for the shed, the figures closing in behind us. The door was barely hanging on its hinges, but it was better than nothing. I shoved Lucas inside and turned just in time to see the man standing at the edge of the clearing, his grin wider than ever. "You can't run forever," he said, his voice low and mocking. "Christmas always comes around again." Inside the shed, I barricaded the door with anything I could find: an old wooden plank, a rusted toolbox, a broken chair. Lucas huddled in the corner, his arms wrapped tightly around his knees, his face buried in his chest. "It's okay," I whispered, even though I didn't believe it. "We're safe now. We're safe." But then I heard it, the faint jingle of bells. It was soft at first, almost imperceptible, but it grew louder and louder, filling the air until it felt like the sound was coming from inside my own head. Lucas looked up at me, his face pale, his eyes wide with terror. "Mom," he whispered, "he's here." Thanks for listening. Don't forget to like, comment, and subscribe for more chilling content. Stay tuned, and we'll see you in the next story.